Book 2. The Rise of Civilization. Chapter 1. Mr. Povondra reads the paper. There are people who collect stamps and others who collect first editions. Mr. Povondra, the doorman at the house of G.H. Bondi, had long been unable to find any meaning in his life. He had been wondering for years whether to become interested in prehistoric graves or develop a passion for international politics. But one evening, without any sort of warning, he suddenly knew what he had so far been lacking, what would make his life worthwhile. Great events usually come without any sort of warning. That evening Mr. Povondra was reading the paper, Mrs. Povondra was darning Frank's socks, and Frank was pretending to study the tributaries on the left bank of the Danube. It was pleasantly quiet. "I should have known," muttered Mr. Povondra. "What should you have known?" asked Mrs. Povondra as she lifted a thread. "About these Newts," said Father Povondra. "It says here that they've sold 70 million of them over the last 3 months." "That's a lot, isn't it?" said Mrs. Povondra. "I should think so. In fact, that's an astonishing number, Mother. Just think, 70 million. Mr. Povondra turned to look at her. "They must have made a fortune selling all of them. And there's all the work they're doing now," he added, after thinking for a moment. "It says here that they're claiming new land and building new islands everywhere at an amazing rate. People can create as much new land as they want now, I should think." "This is wonderful, Mother. I'm telling you, this is a bigger step forward than the discovery of America." Mr. Povondra thought about this for a while. "A new period of history, don't you think? What shall we do, Mother? We're living in great times." There was once more a long period of homely silence. Father Povondra suddenly started drawing harder on his pipe. "And just think, if it wasn't for me, it would never have happened." "What would never have happened?" "All this business with the Newts. This new period of history. If you look at it properly, it was actually me who put it all together." Mrs. Povondra looked up from the holes in the socks. "How's that, then?" "That it was me who let that captain in to see Mr. Bondi on that day. If I hadn't announced him, there was no way the captain could ever have met Mr. Bondi. If it hadn't been for me, Mother, nothing could ever have come of it. Nothing at all." "Maybe this captain could have found someone else," Mrs. Povondra objected. Mr. Povondra rattled indignantly on his pipe. "Now what do you know about that sort of thing? It's only Mr. G.H. Bondi who could do a thing like that. He has more foresight than I don't know who. Anyone else would just have thought it was all madness or a confidence trick, but not Mr. Bondi. He's got a nose for these things, girl." Mr. Povondra considered this for a while. "That captain, what was his name again? Vantok. He didn't look much. Sort of fat old man he was. Any other doorman would have told him he had no business knocking at the door, the master isn't home, and that sort of thing. But, you listen, I had some sort of intuition or something. I announced him to Mr. Bondi. I said to myself, Mr. Bondi might be cross with me, but I'll take the responsibility on myself and I'll announce him. I've always said a doorman has to be a good judge of character. There are times when someone rings at the door, and he looks just like a lord, and he turns out to be a refrigerator salesman. And there are other times when some fat old man turns up at the door, and look what can come of that." "You need to be a good judge of character," Father Povondra mused. "There you see, Frank, that's the difference a man in a humble position can make. You take my example, always try your best to do your duty, just like I've always done." Mr. Povondra nodded his head in pride and self-congratulation. "I could have turned that captain away at the gate and saved myself the bother of going down the steps. Any other doorman wouldn't have cared and shut the gate in his face, he would. And if he did, he'd have ruined this fantastic step forward for mankind. Always bear in mind, Frank, if everyone in the world did his duty, everything would be all right. And pay attention when I'm talking to you." "Yes, Dad," muttered Frank discontentedly. Father Povondra cleared his throat. "Pass me the scissors, Mother. I think I'd better cut this article out so that I've always got something to remind me." So it was that Mr. Povondra started his collection of newspaper cuttings about the Newts. Without his passion as a collector, much of the material we now have would otherwise have been lost. He cut out and saved everything written about the Newts that he could find. It should even be said that after some initial fumblings, he learned to plunder the newspapers in his favorite cafe wherever there was mention of the Newts, and even developed an unusual, almost magical virtuosity in tearing the appropriate article out of the paper and putting it in his pocket right under the nose of the head waiter. It is well known that all collectors are willing to steal and murder if that is what's needed to add a certain item to their collection, but that is not in any way a stain on their moral character. His life was now the life of a collector, and that gave it meaning. Evening after evening he would count and arrange his cuttings under the indulgent eyes of Mrs. Povondra, who knew that every man is partly mad and partly a little child. It was better for him to play with his cuttings than to go out drinking and playing cards. She even made some space in the scullery for all the boxes he had made himself for his collection. Could anything more be asked of a wife? Even Mr. Bondi was surprised at Mr. Povondra's encyclopedic knowledge of everything concerning the Newts, which he showed at every opportunity. With some embarrassment, Mr. Povondra admitted that he collected everything printed about the salamanders and let Mr. Bondi see his boxes. G.H. Bondi kindly praised him for his collection. What does it matter that only great men can be so generous and only powerful people can give pleasure without it costing them a penny? It's all right for those who are great. Mr. Bondi, for instance, told the office of the Salamander Syndicate to send Mr. Povondra all the cuttings to do with the Newts that they did not need to keep in their archives, and lucky Mr. Povondra, somewhat dismayed, received whole parcels of documents in all the languages of the world every day. And for documents in the Cyrillic alphabet, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese script, Bengali, Tamil, Javanese, Burmese, or Talic, he was especially grateful. "When I think," he said about it all, "without me it would never have happened." As we have already said, Mr. Povondra's collection saved much historic material concerning the whole story of the Newts, but that, of course, does not mean to say it was enough to satisfy a scientific historian. Firstly, Mr. Povondra had never received a specialist education as assistant in historic or archival methods, and he made no indication on his cuttings of the source or the date, so that we do not know when or where each document was published. And secondly, faced with so much material piling up around him, Mr. Povondra kept mainly the longest articles which he considered must be the most important, while the shorter reports were simply thrown into the coal scuttle. As a result, through all this period, remarkable few facts and reports were conserved by him. Thirdly, the hand of Mrs. Povondra played a considerable part in the matter. When she carefully filled up one of Mr. Povondra's boxes, she would quietly and secretly pull out some of the cuttings and burn them, which took place several times a year. The only ones she spared were the ones that did not grow in number very fast, such as the cuttings printed in the Malabar, Tibetan, or Coptic scripts. These remained more or less complete, although for certain gaps in our body of knowledge they are not of great value. This means that the material we have available concerning the history of the Newts is very fragmented, like the land records of the 8th century A.D. or the selected writings of the poetess Sappho. But some documents, here and there, did happen to survive about this phase of the great history of the world, and despite all the gaps, we will do our best to summarize them under the title, The Rise of Civilization. Chapter 2. The Rise of Civilization, History of the Newts. In the history of the epoch, announced by G.H. Bondi at the memorable general meeting of the Pacific Export Company with his prophetic words about the coming utopia, it is not possible to measure events in centuries or even decades, as has been possible in previous ages of world history. Instead, we must measure history in units of 3 months, which is how often the quarterly economic statistics appear. In this present period, history, so to speak, is manufactured by mass production. This is why the speed of history is so much greater, estimated to be approximately 5-fold. It is simply not possible nowadays to wait centuries for the world to turn into something good or bad. The migrations of nations, for instance, which at one time was drawn out over several generations, could be completed within 3 years using modern transport methods. Otherwise, there would be no way of making a profit from it. The same applies to the decline of the Roman Empire, the colonization of continents, the massacre of the Indians, and so on. All this could be completed incomparably faster if put into the hands of well-funded business. In this way, the enormous success of the Newts Syndicate and its powerful influence on the history of the world is certainly a sign of things to come. The history of the Newts was characterized from the first by good and rational organization, and that is primarily, although not solely, thanks to the Newts Syndicate. It should be acknowledged that science, philanthropy, education, the press, and other factors played a substantial part in the astonishing expansion and progress of the Newts. But it's still true to say that it was the Newts Syndicate that conquered new continents and coastlines for them, virtually day by day, even when they had to overcome many obstacles to their expansion. The Syndicate's quarterly statements show that the Newts were gradually settled in the ports of India and China, how colonies of Newts overwhelmed the coasts of Africa and jumped over to America, where a new and modern hatchery soon appeared on the Gulf of Mexico. How, as well as the broad waves of colonizations, smaller, pioneering groups of Newts were sent out to establish new places for migration. The Newts Syndicate sent, for instance, 1,000 top-quality Newts as a present to Waterstadt in Holland. 600 were given to the city of Marseille to clean out the old harbor, and similar presents were made elsewhere. The dispersion and settlement of the Newts around the world was, unlike the expansion of mankind, simply well-planned and enormous. Left to nature, it would certainly have taken thousands of years, but that is merely hypothetical. Nature has never been so enterprising and targeted as man's industry and commerce. It seemed that the lively demand for them had its influence on the Newts' own reproductive abilities. The number of tadpoles produced by any one female rose to as much as 150 per year. Losses to sharks and other predatory fish were reduced almost to zero after the Newts had been equipped with underwater pistols and dum-dum bullets to protect themselves. England closed off to Newts? Reuter, in reply to a question in the House of Commons from Mr. J. Leeds, Sir Samuel Mandeville stated today that His Majesty's government had closed the Suez Canal to Newt transports of any kind. He added that no Newt would be permitted to be employed on any shoreline or any sovereign waters of the British Isles. The reason for this measure, Sir Samuel declared, was partly to do with the security of the British Isles, and partly to do with old statutes still in force concerning the elimination of slave trading. In reply to a question from Mr. B. Russell, MP, Sir Samuel stated that this position would, of course, not apply to British colonies and dominions. The expansion of the Newt population did not run smoothly everywhere, of course. In some places, conservative groups took severe protective measures against the introduction of new workforces, seeing the Newts as competition with human workers. 6. Others expressed the fear that the Newts, living on small marine animals, posed a threat to fishing. There were those who argued that the Newts would undermine coastlines and islands with their underwater tunnels and passageways. There were certainly many people who warned against the introduction of the Newts, but whenever any innovation or any progress has been made, it has always met with resistance and mistrust. That was the case with industrial machinery, and it was the case with the Newts. In other places, misunderstandings of other sorts appeared. 7. But the news media all around the world, who understood the enormous commercial possibilities offered by the Newts, provided a great deal of help in these matters, and with the help of effective and large-scale advertising campaigns, the salamanders became established all around the globe and were welcomed with lively interest and even enthusiasm. Trading in Newts was mostly in the hands of the Newts Syndicate, which carried it out with its own specially made tanker ships. The center of trading was the Salamander building in Singapore, which functioned as a kind of Newt stock exchange. As the turnover in Newts rose, trading, of course, became very wild. The Newts Syndicate was no longer able to observe and control all the hatcheries established by the late Captain Van Tak in many places, and especially around the small and remote islands of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Many of the bays inhabited by Newts were left to their own devices. As a result, while the cultivation of salamanders was well organized and controlled in some areas, in others there was extensive hunting of wild Newts, similar in many ways to the seal hunting expeditions that used to take place. The hunting expeditions were to some extent illegal, but as there were no laws protecting the Newts, no one was ever brought to account for anything more serious than setting foot on the territory of a sovereign state without permission. As the Newts on these islands multiplied at an astonishing rate and now and then caused damage to the local people's fields and orchards, these uncontrolled trading in Newts was well organized, and there was an extensive advertising campaign in the press, but the biggest influence in the expansion of the Newt population was the enormous wave of technological idealism which inundated the entire world at that time. G.H. Bondi rightly foresaw that from then on the human spirit would be working with whole new continents and new Atlantises. The whole of the Newt Age was dominated by a lively and fertile dispute among the technically minded as to whether firm land should be constructed with shores of reinforced concrete or merely light land laid down as deposits of marine sand. New and gigantic projects appeared almost every day. There were some Italian engineers who suggested the construction of a Great Italy taking in most of the Mediterranean Sea as far as Tripoli, the Balearic Islands, and the Dodecanese, and others who wanted to establish a new continent to be called Lemuria, to the east of Italian Somalia, which would take in the entire Indian Ocean in one move. With the help of armies of Newts, new islands covering 13.5 acres were indeed laid down near the Somalian port of Mogadishu. Japan planned and partly realized a new great island to cover the former Marian Archipelago and made preparations to combine the Caroline and Marshall Islands into two big islands, provisionally named New Nippon. Each of the two islands was to be created by means of an artificial volcano which would remind their prospective inhabitants of the famous Mount Fuji. It was also rumored that German engineers were secretly building a durable concrete landmass in the Sargasso Sea which was to be the new Atlantis and, it was said, would be a threat to French East Africa, but it seems that this went no further than laying the foundations. In Holland, Zeeland was reclaimed. France combined Guadeloupe, Grande-Terre, Basse-Terre, and La Dégerade into one big island. The United States began to build the first airfield island on the 37th. Meridian, 2 stories high, with an enormous hotel, sports stadium, funfair, and a cinema for 5,000 people. It simply seemed that the last limits imposed on human expansion imposed by the sea had now fallen. A new and radiant age of amazing technical plans began. Man realized that now, at last, he was becoming the lord of the world. And that was thanks to the Newts who had stepped onto the world stage at the right moment, and, as it were, with the force of history. There is no doubt that the Newts would never have burgeoned the way they did if our own technical age had not prepared so many jobs for them and so many places of long-term employment. The future of the workers of the sea now seemed to be guaranteed for centuries to come. Science, too, played an important part in the development of Newt commerce, and quickly turned its attention to investigating both the Newts' physiology and their psychology. Because of this scientific research, people stopped regarding the Newts as some kind of miracle. In the cold light of science, the salamanders lost much of their aura of primordial strangeness and uniqueness. Once they had become the subject of psychological tests, they began to seem very average and uninteresting. Their enormous talents were dismissed by the scientists to the realm of myth. The common or garden salamander was identified, and it turned out to be something entirely dull and quite limited in its abilities. Only the newspapers would now and then display a miracle newt that could multiply 5-figure numbers in its head, but people soon got tired of that, especially when it had been shown that even a mere human could perform the same trick given the right training. People simply began to consider the Newts as much a matter of course as an adding machine or other device. They now no longer saw anything mysterious about them. The Newts no longer seemed to have emerged from the unknown depths of the sea with who knows what purpose. And people never do regard something as mysterious if it serves and benefits them, only if it's something harmful or threatening. And as the Newts, as has been shown, were highly versatile and useful, they were simply accepted as a basic part of a rational and ordinary life. In short, it was entirely natural that the Newts stopped being a sensation, even though there were now as many as 100 million of them. The public interest they had excited had been the interest of a novelty. They still appeared now and then in films, Sally and Andy, the Two Good Salamanders, and on the cabaret stage where singers endowed with an especially bad voice came on in the role of Newts with rasping voices and atrocious grammar. But as soon as the Newts had become a familiar and large-scale phenomenon, the problems they presented, so to speak, were of a different character. Although the great Newt sensation quickly evaporated, it was replaced with something that was somewhat more solid, the Newt question. Not for the first time in the history of mankind, the most vigorous activist in the Newt question was, of course, a woman. This was Madame. Louise Zimmermann, the manager of a guest house for girls in Lausanne, who, with exceptional and boundless energy, propagated this noble maxim around the world: give the newts a proper education. She would tirelessly draw attention both to the newts' natural abilities and to the danger that might arise for human civilization if the salamanders weren't carefully taught to reason and to understand morals, but it was long before she met with anything but incomprehension from the public. Just as the Roman culture disappeared under the onslaught of the barbarians, our own educated civilization will disappear if it is allowed to become no more than an island in a sea of beings that are spiritually enslaved. Our noble ideals cannot be allowed to become dependent on them. She prophesied at 6,357 lectures that she delivered at women's institutes all over Europe, America, Japan, China, Turkey, and elsewhere. If our culture is to survive, there must be education for all. We cannot have any peace to enjoy the gifts of our civilization, nor the fruits of our culture, while all around us there are millions and millions of wretched and inferior beings artificially held down in the state of animals. Just as the slogan of the 19th century was "freedom for women," so the slogan of our own age must be "give the newts a proper education," and on she went. Thanks to her eloquence and her incredible persistence, Madame Louise Zimmermann mobilized women all round the world and gathered sufficient funds to enable her to found the first Newt Lyceum at Beaulieu, near Nice, where the tadpoles of salamanders working in Marseille and Toulon were instructed in French language and literature, rhetoric, public behavior, mathematics, and cultural history. The girls' School for Newts in Menton was slightly less successful, as the staple courses in music, diet, and cookery and fine handwork, which Madame Zimmermann insisted on for primarily pedagogical reasons, met with a remarkable lack of enthusiasm, if not with a stubborn hostility among its young students. In contrast with this, though, the first public examinations for young newts was such an instant and startling success that they were quickly followed by the establishment of the Marine Polytechnic for Newts at Cannes and the Newts University at Marseille with the support of the Society for the Care and Protection of Animals. It was at this university that the first newt was awarded a doctorate of law. The matter of newt education now began to develop quickly and along its normal path. Exemplary though the École Zimmermann were, the most progressive teachers raised a number of serious objections to them. In particular, they insisted that the established humanistic schooling for young humans was not suitable for young newts. They certainly recommended the teaching of literature and history, but they also recommended that as much time and facilities as possible should be devoted to modern practical subjects such as the natural sciences, craftwork, technical understanding, physical education, and so on. These reform schools, or schools for practical life as they were known, were, in their turn, passionately opposed by those who supported a classical education and declared that newts could only come to approach the lofty cultural level of human beings on the basis of Latin, and that there was no point in teaching them to speak if they weren't also taught to recite poetry and perform oratory with the eloquence of Cicero. There was a long and rather heated debate which was finally settled when the schools for salamanders were taken over by the state and schools for human children were reformed so that they came as close as possible to the ideals of the reform schools for newts. It was now a matter of course that other countries would also declare their belief in making the newts have a proper, state-supervised education. One by one, all the seafaring nations declared themselves for it, with the exception of Great Britain, of course. And because these schools for newts were not burdened with the classical traditions of schools for human children, and were able to make use of all the latest methods in psychotechnology, technical education, pre-military exercises, and other educational innovations, these schools quickly evolved into the most modern and scientifically advanced educational system in the world, envied by teachers and students everywhere. As soon as there are schools, there needs to be a language, and that raised the question of which of the world's languages would be the best for the salamanders to learn. The first newts in the Pacific Islands spoke, of course, in the pidgin English they had picked up from natives and sailors. Many of them spoke Malay or other local dialects. Newts bred for the market in Singapore were taught to speak basic English, the scientifically simplified English that gets by with a few hundred expressions without the encumbrance of outdated grammar, and as a result this modified version of Standard English began to be called Salamander English. In the exemplary École Zimmermann, the Newts expressed themselves in the language of Corneille, not of course for any chauvinistic reason, but because that is simply part of any good education. At the reform schools, on the other hand, Esperanto was learned so that it would serve as a lingua franca. There were 5 or 6 other new universal languages which emerged around this time with the intention of replacing the Babylonian confusion of human languages with a single, common mother tongue for the whole world of newts and men. Needless to say that there were countless disputes about which of these international languages is the most useful, most euphonious, and the most universal. The final result, of course, was that there was a different universal language propagated in every nation. All this became simpler when the education of newts was nationalized. The newts in every state were to be brought up in the appropriate local language. Although the salamanders found it relatively easy to learn foreign languages and were keen to do so, there were found to be some peculiar difficulties, partly to do with adapting their speech organs to human language and partly to do with mainly psychological reasons. They had difficulty, for instance, in pronouncing long words with many syllables, and would try to reduce them to a single syllable which they would bark out in a rather nasal voice. They would say L instead of R and lisp on their sibilants. In short, every language they learned took on new and characteristic forms in their mouths, reorganizing it into something simpler and more rudimentary. It is worth nothing that their neologisms, pronunciations, and simplified grammar was quickly adopted by both the simplest people in the ports and by the so-called best people. And from the ports, this way of speaking spread out into the newspapers and was soon in general use. Even many humans stopped attending to grammatical gender, word endings were dropped, declinations disappeared, our golden youth neglected to say R properly and learned to lisp. Few educated people were any longer certain what was meant by indeterminism or transcendent, simply because these words, even for human beings, were too long and too hard to pronounce. In short, for good or for ill, the newts became able to speak almost every language of the world, according to what coast they lived on. About this time, some of the Czech national newspapers began to complain bitterly, no doubt with good reason, that none of the newts could speak their language. If there were salamanders who could speak Portuguese, Dutch, and the languages of other small nations, why were there none that could speak Czech? It was true, they conceded in regretful and learned terms, that Czechoslovakia had no sea coasts, and that means there will be no marine newts here. But that does not mean that Czechs should not play the same part in the culture of the world as many of the other nations, whose language was being taught to thousands of newts, or perhaps even a greater part. It was only right and proper that the newts should also have some knowledge of Czech culture. But how were they to be informed about it if none of them knew the Czech language? It was not likely that someone somewhere in the world would acknowledge this cultural debt and found a chair in Czech and Czechoslovak literature at one of the newt universities. As the poet puts it, trust no one in the whole wide world, we have no friends out there. And so one of the newspaper articles declared that Czechs themselves would have to do something to rectify the matter. Whatever we've done in the world, it asserted, we've done by our own efforts. We have a duty and the right to try to recruit friends even among newts, but it seems that the foreign ministry does not have much interest in spreading the good name of our country and our products among newts, even though other, smaller nations devote millions to opening their cultural treasures to them, as well as generating interest in their industrial products. This article attracted a great deal of interest from the Confederation of Industry, and one result was that a brief handbook of Czech for newts was published, complete with illustrations of Czechoslovak handwriting styles. It may seem hard to believe, but this little book was remarkably successful and sold more than 700 copies. Matters of education and language were, of course, only one aspect of the great newt problem which grew up, as it were, under people's feet. The question quickly arose, for instance, of how people were to behave towards the newts in, so to speak, the social sphere. At first, in the almost prehistoric period of the Newt Age, there were, of course, societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals which passionately ensured that the newts were not treated in ways that were cruel or inhumane. And it was thanks to their continuous efforts that government offices almost everywhere saw to it that the regulations set out by police and veterinary inspectors for the conditions of other livestock applied also to newts. Opponents of vivisection signed many protests and petitions calling for a ban on scientific experiments on live newts, and many countries did indeed pass laws to that effect. But as the newts became more educated, it became less clear whether newts should simply be included under animal protection legislation. For some reason, not entirely clear, it seemed rather inappropriate. And so the Salamander Protection League was founded under the patronage of the Duchess of Huddersfield. This league, numbering more than 200 members, mostly in England, achieved many effective and praiseworthy improvements for the newts. In particular, they succeeded in establishing special newt playgrounds on the coast where, undisturbed by inquisitive human eyes, their meetings and sporting celebrations took place, by which they probably meant their secret dances once a month. They ensured that all places of education, and they even saw to it that places where newts lived or worked were surrounded by a high wooden fence. However, it was not long before these commendable private initiatives, intended to establish a fair and humane relationship between human society and that of newts, were found not to be enough. It was relatively easy to include salamanders into industrial processes, but it was much harder and more complicated to include them in any way into the existing precepts of society. People who were more conservative asserted that there was no question to be solved, there were no legal or social problems. The newts, they said, were simply the property of their employers, and the employers were responsible for them and any damage they might cause. Despite their undoubted intelligence, the salamanders were legally no more than property, an object or an estate, and any legal measure concerning the newts would, they said, be a violation of the holy rights of private property. In response, others objected that as the newts were a kind of intelligent being and to a large extent responsible for their actions, they might freely find various ways of violating existing laws. How could a newt owner be expected to bear the responsibility for any offenses committed by his salamanders? A risk of that sort would certainly destroy any private initiative where the employment of newts was concerned. There are no fences in the sea, they said. Newts cannot be closed in and kept under supervision. For this reason, it would be necessary to pass laws directed at the newts themselves. In this way, they would respect the human legal order and conduct themselves in accordance with the regulations laid down for them. As far as is known, the first laws governing salamanders were passed in France. The first paragraph set out the newts' obligations in the event of mobilization for war. The second, known as the Lex Duval, instructed the newts that they were allowed to settle only on those parts of the coast indicated by their owners or an appropriate office of local government. The third stipulated that newts were required under any circumstances to obey any order given them by a member of the police. Any failure to obey a police order would entitle police authorities to punish them by means of incarceration in a place that was dry and brightly lit, or even to deny them the right to work for long periods of time. The left-wing parties responded by putting a motion to Parliament that a legal social system for newts should be worked out. These social measures would limit the amount of work required from them and place certain obligations on anyone employing newts, e.g. 14 days leave at mating time in the spring. The extreme left objected that the newts should be designated as enemies of the working class because they work too hard in the service of capitalism, work for almost nothing, and thus they endanger the working man's standard of living. This demand was followed up with a strike by harbor workers in Brest and large demonstrations in Paris. Many people were injured, and Duval was forced to resign his job as minister. In Italy, the salamanders were placed under the authority of a special newt corporation made up of employers and public officials. In Holland, they were governed by the ministry, supervising coastal constructions. In short, every state solved the newt problem in its own different way. But most of the public decisions governing public responsibility and largely limiting the animal freedom enjoyed by the newts were roughly the same anywhere you looked. It should be understood that as soon as the first laws for newts were passed, there were people who, in the name of jurisdictional logic, reasoned that if human society places certain obligations on the salamanders, it would have to grant them certain rights. Any state that lays down laws for newts acknowledges, ipso facto, that they are beings capable of acting freely and responsibly, as legal subjects, or even as members of the state, in which case their status as citizens would need to be adjusted in whatever legislation they lived under. It would, of course, have been possible to designate the Newts as foreign immigrants, but in that case the state would be unable to exact certain services and duties from them in the event of mobilization for war, which every country in the civilized world did do, with the exception of England. In the event of armed conflict, we would certainly want the Newts to protect our shorelines, but in that case we could not deny them certain civil rights, such as the right to vote, the right of assembly, the right to participate in various public offices, and so on. It was even suggested that the Newts had a kind of independent state of their own under the water. But these considerations and others like them remained purely academic. They never resulted in any practical solution, mainly because the Newts themselves never asked for any civil rights from anyone. There was another lively debate about the Newts which took place without their direct interest or participation, and that was around the question of whether they could be baptized. The Catholic Church took a firm stand from the start and said they certainly could not. As the Newts were not the descendants of Adam, they were not affected by original sin, the sacrament of baptism could not be used to cleanse them of it. The Holy Church had no wish to decide the question as to whether the Newts had an immortal soul or any other share of God's love and salvation. Their good wishes towards the Newts could only be shown by a special prayer for them, to be read on certain days at the same time as prayers for souls in purgatory and intercessions for unbelievers. For the Protestant Church it was not so simple. They acknowledged that the Newts had reason and could therefore understand Christian teaching, but they hesitated to make them members of the Church and therefore brothers in Christ. So they restricted themselves to issuing an abridged form of the Holy Gospel for Newts on waterproof paper and distributed many million copies of it. They also considered whether they should work out some kind of basic Christian for them, a rudimentary and simplified version of Christianity analogous to basic English. But all attempts in this direction created so many theological disputes that in the end they had to give up on the idea. Some of the religious sects, especially those from America, had fewer scruples in the matter. They sent their missionaries out to the Newts to teach them the true faith and baptize them according to the words of Scripture, "Go out into the world and teach all nations." But very few missionaries succeeded in getting past the wooden fences that divided the Newts from people. Employers would not let them have access to the Newts because their preaching might keep them away from work. So every so often you would see a preacher standing beside a tarred fence, zealously propounding the Word of God, while the dogs fiercely barked at their enemy from the other side. As far as is known, monism was spread quite widely among the Newts, with some of the Newts believing in materialism and some of them in the gold standard or some other scientific doctrine. One popular philosopher called Georg Sequens even compiled a special set of religious teachings for the Newts, centered around a belief in something called the Great Salamander. This system of faith met with no success whatsoever among the Newts but found many converts among human beings, especially in the major cities where almost overnight a large number of secret temples for the salamander cult appeared. Most of the Newts themselves, somewhat later on, adopted a different faith, although it is not known how they came to it. This was the worship of Moloch, whom they imagined as an enormous newt with a human head. It was said they had gigantic metal idols of this god under the water, which they had made by Armstrong or Krupp. However, no more details about this cult or its rituals were ever learned, despite their reputation for exceptional cruelty and secrecy, because they took place underwater. It seems that this faith spread among them because the name Moloch reminded them of the Latin and German words for newts, molche. It is clear from the preceding paragraphs that the Newt question started out, and for a long time remained, centered around whether and to what extent the Newts had reason and whether, as clearly civilized beings, they would be capable of making use of certain human rights, even though only on the edge of the ordered society in which human beings lived. In other words, it was an internal question for individual states, and it was settled in the context of citizens. It was many years before it occurred to anyone that the Newt question could have wide-ranging international importance, or that it might become necessary to deal with the salamanders not only as intelligent beings, but also as a Newt collective or nation of Newts. In truth, it should be said that the first step towards this conception of the Newt problem was taken by some of the more eccentric Christian sects who tried to baptize the Newts as instructed by Holy Scripture, go out into the entire world and teach every nation. In this way, it was made explicit that the Newts were a sort of nation. But the first international and significant acknowledgement of the Newts as a nation was in the famous speech given at the Communist Internationals, signed by Comrade Molotov and addressed to all the repressed and revolutionary Newts throughout the world. This call seems to have had no direct effect on the Newts themselves, but it was widely discussed in the press around the world and had great influence, at least, in that a rain of fervent invitations from every side began to fall on the Newts, exhorting them, as the nation of Greater Newtdom, they should align themselves with this or that idealist political or social program of human society. Now the International Bureau of Employment in Geneva began to concern itself with the Newt problem. Here there were two views in opposition to each other. One side acknowledged the Newts as a new working class and strove to have all social legislation extended to them, regulating length of working day, paid holidays, insurance for invalidity and old age, and so on. The other view, in contrast, declared that the Newts were a growing danger as competition for human manpower, and working Newts were antisocial and should simply be banned. Not only employers, representatives objected to this idea, but also delegates from the working people, pointing out that the Newts were not just a new army of workers, but also a major and growing market. As has been said, in recent times the numbers employed in metalworking, working tools, equipment, metal idols for the Newts, weapon manufacture, chemical industry, underwater explosives, paper industry, school books for the Newts, cement manufacture, forestry, artificial foodstuffs, salamander food, and many other areas had all risen at a rate unprecedented in peacetime. There was a rise of 27% in shipping tonnage compared with the period before. The rise in employment and prosperity for people indirectly caused a rise in turnover in other branches of industry too. Most recently, the Newts had been ordering more engineering parts according to their own designs, using them to assemble pneumatic drills, hammers, underwater motors, printing machinery, underwater radio equipment and other machinery, all to their own plans, and all done underwater. These machine parts were paid for by higher productivity. By now, a fifth of all world production in heavy industry and in fine mechanics were dependent on orders from the Newts. If you put an end to the Newts, you can put an end to one factory in 5. Instead of modern prosperity, there would be millions unemployed. The International Bureau of Employment could not, of course, simply ignore this objection, and in the end, and after long discussion, it arrived at this compromise solution, that the above-named group of employees, amphibians, may be employed only on water or underwater, and on the shore only as far as 10 meters above the high water line. They may not. Restrictions on Newt manufacturing were set out in 19 legal paragraphs, which we will not cite in more detail, mainly because, needless to say, nobody paid. In other respects, international recognition of the Newts was somewhat slower, especially where cultural contact was concerned. When the much-quoted article, The Geological Structure of the Seabed Around the Islands of the Bahamas, was published in the specialist press and the name John Seaman given as the author, then of course nobody realized that this was the scientific work of an educated salamander. But when Newt researchers appeared at scientific congresses or addressed various academic or learned societies to report on their studies in oceanography, geography, hydrobiology, higher mathematics, or other precise sciences, and it caused much consternation and indignation, expressed by the great Dr. Martel in the following words: "Do these vermin think they've got something to teach us?" The learned Dr. Onoshita from Japan, who dared to quote from a report by a Newt, something to do with the development of the yolk sac of the fry of the deep-sea fish Argyropelicus hemigymnus coco, he was ostracized by the scientific community and committed harakiri. It was a matter of honor and professional pride among university scientists that they don't take into account any of the scientific work done by a Newt. This increased the attention, if not outrage, given to the Centre Universitaire de Nice, when it invited Dr. Charles Mercier, a highly learned Newt from the harbor at Toulon, to give a celebratory lecture on the theme of conic sections in non-Euclidean geometry, which was met with remarkable success. Those attending the event included a delegate from Geneva, Megame. Maria Diminianu. This outstanding and generous lady was so impressed by Dr. Mercier's modesty and erudition, Pauvre petit, she is said to have sighed, il est tellement laid, that she made it a part of her tirelessly active life to have the Newts accepted as a member of the United Nations. Politicians tried in vain to explain to this eloquent and energetic lady that the salamanders could not be a member of the United Nations because they were not a sovereign state and did not have any territory. Madame Dimineanu began to propagate the idea that the Newts should have their own free territory somewhere on the planet and their own underwater state. This idea was, of course, rather unwelcome, if not directly dangerous. Eventually, a happy solution was found in that the United Nations would set up a special commission for the study of the Newt question, which was to include 2 delegates from the Newt world, the first to be called on, under pressure from Madame M. Dimineanu, was Dr. Charles Mercier of Toulon, and the second was a certain Don Mario, a fat and learned Newt from Cuba carrying out scientific work in the field of plankton and neritic pelagial. In this way, the Newts reached the highest ever international acknowledgement of their existence. So we see the salamanders achieving a steep and continuous rise. Their population is now estimated at 7,000 million, although with increasing civilization their fertility shows a marked decline, to 20 or 30 tadpoles per female per year. They have occupied more than 60% of the world's coastlines. Coasts around the polar regions are still not habitable, but Newts from Canada have begun to colonize the coast of Greenland, even succeeding in pushing the Eskimos back inland and taking the fishing industry and the trade in fish oils into their own hands. The upsurge in their material well-being went hand in hand with their progress in civilization. They joined the ranks of educated nations with compulsory schooling and can boast of many hundred of their own underwater newspapers distributed in millions of copies, scientific institutions whose buildings were an example to all, and so on. It should be understood that this cultural ascent was not always smooth and without internal disagreements. We know remarkably little about the internal affairs of the Newts, but there are some indications, such as Newts found dead with cuts to their noses and heads, that, under the ocean, there was a long, protracted, and passionate dispute under the ocean between the young Newts and the old. The young Newts seem clearly to have been in favor of progress without exception or reserve, and declared that even under the water they should pursue all the educations known on the dry land with all their efforts, even including football, flirting, fascism, and sexual perversions. Whereas the old Newts, it seemed, were more conservative to the nature of Newtdom, were unwilling to give up the good old animal habits and instincts. They left no doubt about their condemnation of the young Newts, lust for novelty, and saw therein a decline. We can imagine that slogans such as, "Back to the Miocene," "Down with all humanizing influences," "Fight for the right for Newts to be undisturbed," and so on, were coined. Without a doubt, there were all the preconditions for a lively generational conflict of views and for a profound revolution in the Newts' spiritual development. Unfortunately, we are not able to give any more precise details, but we hope that the Newts made what they could out of this conflict. So now we see the Newts on the way to their greatest flowering, but the world of human beings, too, was enjoying unprecedented prosperity. New continents were planned out with great enthusiasm, shallow waters were converted to dry land, and artificial islands for aeroplanes appeared in the middle of the oceans. But compared with the enormous technical projects which would entirely reconstruct the globe, these were as nothing, and the projects awaited nothing but someone to finance them. The Newts worked tirelessly in all the seas and on the edge of all the continents for as long as the night lasted. They seemed contented and asked for nothing for themselves but something to do and a piece of coastline where they could drill their holes and build the paths to their dark homes. They had their cities under the water and under the land, their subterranean metropoles, their Essens and their Birminghams, 20 to 50 meters down at the bottom of the sea. They have their overcrowded industrial zones, ports, transport lines, and cities of 1 million inhabitants. In short, they had their more or less 31 unknown but, it seems, highly technically developed world. Although they did not have their own kilns and foundries, they were given metals by human beings in exchange for work. They did not have their own explosives, but they bought them from human beings. Their fuel for transport was the sea with its tides and its currents, with its undertows and differences in temperature. They had to obtain their turbines from human beings, but they were well able to make use of them. And what is civilization, if not the ability to make use of things invented by others? Even if the Newts, let us say, had no thoughts of their own, they were well able to have their own science. They had no music or literature, but got by perfectly well without them. And people began to see that thanks to the Newts, everything was fantastically modern. People could even learn something from the Newts, and no wonder. Were the Newts not amazingly successful, and what should people take their example from if not from success? Never in the history of mankind had so much been manufactured, constructed, and earned as in this great age. With the Newts came enormous progress and the ideal known as quantity. The phrase, "we people of the Newt Age," became widely used and used with justified pride. Where could we have got in the old-fashioned human age with the slow, petty, and useless fiddling known as culture, art, pure science, or such like? The self-aware people of the Newt Age declared that they would no longer waste their time delving into the questions of the universe. They would have enough to do just with the quantity of things being manufactured. The whole future of the world would consist in constantly raising production and consumption, and for that there would need to be still more Newts, so that they could produce even more and consume even more. The Newts were simply a matter of quantity. They had achieved their epoch-making changes because there were so many of them. Only now could man's ingenuity work at full effectiveness, because it was working on a huge scale with extremely high manufacturing capacity and a record financial turnover. In short, this was a great age. And what was now still missing for universal prosperity and contentment to make this a true happy new age? What was preventing the creation of the utopia we all longed for, where all these technical triumphs and magnificent possibilities would be harvested, where human happiness would combine with Newts, industry to open new horizons further and further to beyond what anyone could imagine? Actually, there was nothing to prevent it, as now trade with the Newts would be crowned with the wisdom of the world's most competent administrators, who would also ensure in advance that the machinery of the new age would run smoothly. In London, a conference took place, attended by seafaring nations, where the International Convention on Salamanders was worked out and approved.
The high officials who signed the convention agreed to bind themselves not to send their Newts into the sovereign waters of other states, not to allow their Newts in any way to violate the territorial integrity or acknowledged sphere of interest of any other state, that they would not in any way interfere in matters affecting the Newts belonging to any other seafaring power, that any dispute between its salamanders and those of another state would be settled by the Court of Arbitration at The Hague, that Newts would not be armed with any weapons of a caliber exceeding that which is normal for underwater shotguns, that they would not allow their Newts to establish close contact with the salamanders of other sovereign states, that they would not assist their Newts in the construction of new land or extending their territory without previous permission from the Standing Marine Commission in Geneva, and so on. On the other hand, the British suggestion that marine powers should bind themselves not to oblige their Newts to carry out any military exercises was rejected. The French suggestion that the salamanders should be internationalized and subjected to the authority of an international Newt Commission for regulating world waters was rejected. The German suggestion that every Newt should have the symbol of the state to which it belonged branded into its skin was rejected. Another German suggestion that every marine state be allowed only a certain number of Newts so that the numbers in each state would be in proportion to each other was rejected. The Italian suggestion that states with an excess of salamanders be allocated new shores or areas of the seabed for colonization was rejected. The Japanese suggestion that they be given an international mandate to govern the Newts as representatives of the colored races, the Newts were by nature black, was rejected. Most of these suggestions were deferred for the next conference of marine powers, which for various reasons did not take place.
By this international action, wrote Monsieur Jules Sauerstoff in Le Temps, the future of the Newts is assured, along with peaceful development for people for many decades to come. We congratulate the London Conference for its successful conclusions on some difficult questions, and we also congratulate the Newts that by this statute they come under the protection of the court at The Hague. They will henceforth be able to devote themselves to their work and their underwater progress with a sense of peace and trust. It should be emphasized that the removal of the Newt problem from the field of politics, which is what the London Conference has achieved, is one of the most important assurances we have of world peace. The disarming of the salamanders in particular will do a great deal to reduce the likelihood of underwater conflicts between individual states. The fact is that even though many border disputes and power struggles continue between states on almost every continent, there is no current threat to world peace, at least not from the direction of the sea. But on dry land, too, we seem to have a better assurance of peace than ever before. The seafaring nations are fully occupied with the construction of new shores and will be able to increase their territory by reclaiming land from the sea instead of trying to extend their frontiers on dry land. There will no longer be any need to fight with iron and gas for every tiny piece of land. all that is needed will be the picks and shovels wielded by the Newts for every state to build as much territory as it needs. And it is the London Convention which ensures that the peaceful labor of the Newts will bring peace and prosperity for all the nations of the world. The world has never before been so close to a lasting peace and a quiet but glorious efflorescence than now. Instead of the Newt problem about which so much has been written and said, we will now have good reason to talk of the golden age of the Newt. Newt market. Czechoslovak press agency. Reports issued by the Salamander Syndicate for the end of the quarter show a 30% rise in Newt trading. Nearly 70 million Newts were supplied over this period, especially to South and Central America, Indochina, and Italian Somalia. Plans are in progress for deepening and widening the Panama Canal, dredging Guayaquil Harbor, and the deepening of shallow waters in the Torres Straits, which, according to the latest estimates, will involve moving 9,000 million cubic meters of firm land. Construction of islands for major airports between Madeira and Bermuda is not due to start until next spring. Newt market. Czechoslovak press agency reports issued by the Salamander Syndicate for the end of the quarter show a 30% rise in Newt trading. Nearly 70 million Newts were supplied over this period, especially to South and Central America, Indochina, and Italian Somalia. Plans are in progress for deepening and widening the Panama Canal, dredging Guayaquil Harbor, and the deepening of shallow waters in the Torres Straits, which, according to the latest estimates, will involve moving 9,000 million cubic meters of firm land. Construction of islands for major airports between Madeira and Bermuda is not due to start until next spring. Creation of the Marian Islands under Japanese authority is still in progress. 840 acres of new land, light land as it is called, has been created so far between the islands of Tinian and Saipan. Newt prices are very strong due to the increasing demand at leading 61 and Team 620. Supplies are adequate. Havas, the Australian trade union leader Harry McNamara, declared a general strike for all workers in the shipping, transport, electronics, and related trades because of the belief by members of these trades that the import of working Newts into Australia should come under strict control in accordance with immigration laws. In contrast, Australian farmers have been agitating to have restrictions on the import of Newts eased because demand for domestically grown maize and animal fats, especially sheep fat, has substantially increased in order to feed them. The government wants to have a compromise. The Newt Syndicate offers to make a payment of 6 shillings to the trades unions for each Newt imported, and the government is willing to guarantee that the Newts will be employed only in the water, which, for reasons of public decency, they will remain immersed in up to the chest. The trade unions, though, insist the Newts show no more than their heads and ask for a payment of 10 shillings per Newt in accordance with registration taxes. It seems most likely that an agreement will be reached that involves contributions from the public purse. Drowning people saved by Newts. Madras, the 3rd of April. The steamer, Indian Star, collided with a boat carrying around 40 natives in Madras Harbor, putting them all in danger of drowning. Before a police boat could be sent out, a number of Newts working on the removal of mud from the dock area rushed to their assistance and carried 36 drowning people back to dry land. One of the salamanders was seen personally to pull 3 women and 2 children from the water. As a reward for their noble actions, the local authorities wrote them a letter of thanks, which was presented to them in a waterproof case. On the other hand, many of the local residents were appalled at the Newts, having been allowed to touch drowning people who belonged to a higher caste. This was because the Newts are regarded as unclean and therefore as untouchable. Several thousand natives gathered at the dockside, insisting that the Newts be removed from the harbor area. Police, however, succeeded in maintaining order. There were 3 deaths and 120 arrests. Peace was restored by 10 o'clock in the evening, and the salamanders have returned to work. Sat ne K Chrit Salam Ander BWTAT. Sakadguan tlapne salam under BWTAT o the niber chines imwana bingwo gandi suk na muy molopwana salam under Sri Mwana Gwens. Ogdi limbo ogdi BWTAT na salam under Keri PCHE Ogandi pwa ogandi te urmaswali suk, na ne urlingo tislamli kcher oganda salam Andrias sahti. Bend optonga kechi simbwana maith, salam. S. Trade. Singapore, the 4th of October, leading 63.heavy 317.team 648.odd jobs 26.35.trash 0.08.spawn 80,132. Readers can find reports of this sort every day in the financial sections of the papers between reports on the price of cotton, tin, or wheat. But do you know what is meant by these mysterious words and figures? Yes, they refer to the trade in salamanders or S-trade, but most readers' idea of what these figures actually mean is less precise. Perhaps they imagine a big marketplace swarming with thousands and thousands of newts, where buyers come in their sun helmets and turbans, inspect the goods on offer, and finally point to a healthy, well-developed young newt saying, "I'd like to buy this piece, what is its cost?" In reality, the newt market looks somewhat different. In the marble-clad S-Trade building in Singapore, you will not see a single newt, only lively and elegant officials in white suits taking telephone orders. "Yes, sir." "Leading costs 63. How many? 200? That will be all right. 20 heavy and 180 team. Okay, that's quite clear. The ship sets sail in 5 weeks' time." "Right? Thank you, sir." The whole of the S-Trade Palace is abuzz with telephone calls. It seems more like an office or a bank than a market. But this white and grand-looking building with the Ionian columns at the front is a marketplace more famous than the Harun ar-Rashid Bazaar in Baghdad. But let us return to the market report mentioned above with all its commercial jargon. Leading means simply the specially selected, most intelligent newts, usually about 3 years old and carefully trained to become supervisors and managers in the newts' work colonies. They are sold individually and without regard to their body weight. They are valued solely for their intelligence. Singapore leading, all of whom speak good English, are considered best of all and the most reliable. There are also various other kinds of newts given positions of responsibility, such as the capitanos, engineers, Malayan chiefs, formanders, and so on. But it is the leading newts that are thought the most valuable. Their present value is about $60. The heavies are muscular newts, usually about 2 years old and weighing between 100 and 120 pounds. They are sold only in squads known as bodies, consisting of 6 individuals each. They have been trained to perform the heaviest physical work, such as rock breaking, removing boulders, and so on. If a report states that heavies are at $317, that means that the cost if each body is $317. Each squad of heavies is usually assigned to one leading, which will act as supervisor. Team are the ordinary working newts, weighing between 80 and 100 pounds each. They are sold only in working groups, teams, of 20. They are intended for use together on major tasks, and are often used for dredging, construction of dikes and dams, and so on. Each team of 20 will have a leading to supervise it. The odd jobs constitute a class of their own. These are newts that, for one reason or another, were never trained for collective or specialized work. This could be because they grew up outside the large specialist newt farms run by specialists. They are, in fact, half wild, but can often be very talented. They can be bought individually or by the dozen, and can be used for various kinds of supplementary or minor jobs for which a whole squad of newts would not be needed. If the leadings can be seen as the elite of the newt world, the odd jobs can be seen as something like the proletariat. Recently, they have commonly been bought as the raw material for newts which can be trained further into leading, heavy, team, or trash. The trash are the less valuable newts which are weak or physically defective. They are not sold as individuals or in squads, but in bulk by weight, typically several dozen tons at a time. The price of a kilogram of live weight is currently between 7 and 10 cents. It is not actually known what they are used for or why they are bought. Maybe they are put to some kind of light work in water. To avoid misunderstanding, you should remember that newts are not edible for man. They are bought almost exclusively by Chinese middlemen. Where they take them has never been ascertained. Spawn consists of tadpoles up the age of 12 months. They are bought and sold by hundreds and enjoy a lively trade, mainly because they are cheap to buy and cheap to transport. They grow into adult newts, capable of work, at the place where they are to be employed. The spawn are transported in barrels, as although adult newts need to leave the water every day, the tadpoles never do. It is not unusual for individuals of exceptional talent to emerge from among the spawn, even more capable than the typical leading. This adds a peculiar interest to dealing in tadpoles. These highly talented newts can then be sold for several $100s each. The American millionaire, Denneker, paid as much as $2,000 for a newt that spoke 9 languages fluently and had it transported on a special ship all the way to Miami. The transport alone cost nearly $20,000. It has recently become popular to buy tadpoles for the newt stables, where fast-sporting newts are selected and trained. They are then harnessed in groups of 3 onto flatboats in the form of a shell. These shell races of boats pulled by newts are now the height of fashion and the favorite pastime of young American girls in Palm Beach, Honolulu, and Cuba. They are known as Triton races or Venus regattas. The young women competing will stand in the light shell-shaped boat and scud across the water dressed in the shortest and most alluring swimsuits, controlling the team of 3 newts through silken reins. The prize is merely the title, Venus. Mr. J.S. Tinker, known as the Tin Can King, bought a trio of racing newts for his little daughter, Poseidon, Hengist, and King Edward, for at least $36,000. But all this is not part of the S-trade proper, which limits itself to the provision, round the world, of reliable working leadings, heavies, and teams. We have already mentioned the newt farms. The reader ought not to imagine fields and enormous breeding pens. The farms consist of no more than a few miles of bare coastline, with a few scattered huts of corrugated iron. One hut is for the vet, one for the manager, and the others are for the supervising personnel. It is only when the tide goes out that it is possible to see the long fences running out into the sea and dividing the beach into a number of basins. One is for the tadpoles, the second for the leading class, and so on. Each class is fed and exercised separately, but always at night. At sunset, the newts come out of their holes in the shore and gather around their teachers, who are ordinary old soldiers. First comes the talking lesson. The teacher will say a word such as dig out loud to the newts and mime its meaning. Then they form into ranks of 4 and they are taught to march. This is followed by a half-hour of physical exercises and a period of rest in the water. After the break, they are how to handle various tools and weapons, and then, under the supervision of their teachers, they do practical work on underwater constructions for about 3 hours. After this work, they go back into the water where they are fed on dried food for newts, consisting mainly of corn flour and fat. Leadings and heavies are also given meat. Laziness and disobedience are punished by withholding food. There are no other physical punishments, mainly because salamanders have virtually no sense of pain. As soon as the sun rises on the newt farms, there is a deathly silence. The humans go to bed and the newts disappear under the sea. There are only 2 times in the year when this procedure is not followed. Once in the mating season, when the newts are left to their own devices for 2 weeks, and secondly, when the tanker from the newt syndicate steams into the farm with orders to the farmer about how many newts of what classes are to be taken away. This takes place at night. The ship's captain, the farm manager, and a vet sit at a table under the lamplight, while the supervisors and ship's ratings close off the newts' access to the sea. Then the newts come one at a time to the table to be judged whether they are suitable or not. The newts chosen are put into the dinghy and taken on board the tanker. Mostly, they are quite willing to collaborate in this affair, with little more ever needed than a sharp word of command. There are rare occasions when mild force is needed in form of handcuffs. The tadpoles, of course, are caught in nets. Once on board the newt tankers, the salamanders are transported under conditions just as humane and hygienic. They receive highly nutritious food, and the water in their tanks is changed every day. The death rate on the voyage hardly reaches 10%. At the request of animal protection societies, every newt tanker has a chaplain on board who watches over how the crew behave towards the newts and is required to preach to them every night that they should always show respect for humans, always do as they are told, and always feel love for their prospective employers, who would never show anything but fatherly concern for their well-being. Fatherly concern must certainly be a difficult concept to explain to newts, as fatherhood is something unknown to them. The better-educated salamanders adopted the name Papa Newt for the ship's chaplains. The newts were also shown educational films during the voyage, which displayed not only the wonders of human technology, but also what work and duties would be expected of the newts. These films were found to be very effective. There are those who say that S-trade stands for slave trade. Well, as disinterested observers, we can say that if the former slave trade had been as well organized and hygienic and as perfectly operated as the current trade in newts, then we could only offer the slaves our congratulations. The more expensive salamanders in particular are treated very well, if only because the captain and crew of the newt tankers are depend on the lives of the newts entrusted to them for their own wages. The author of this article has seen personally how the toughest of seamen on tanker SS-14 were deeply touched when 240 top-class newts in one of the tanks became ill and suffered serious diarrhea. They went to see them almost with tears in their eyes and gave expression to their humane feelings with the rough words, "These bastards owe us too much to die on us now." Buccaneers of the XX Century EEK. It was 11 at night when the captain ordered the national flag to be taken down and put out the dinghy. It was a bright, moonlit night. I think it was Gardner Island we rowed out to in the Phoenix Archipelago. On moonlit nights like that, the newts come out onto the shore and dance. You can go up close to them and they won't hear you. They're so obsessed with this dance of theirs, all there together and saying nothing. There were 20 of us who went on shore carrying oars. We spread out all around the swarm of newts on the beach and surrounded them in the darkness, apart from the milky light of the moon. It's hard to describe what it feels like to see those newts dancing. About 300 of them sit on their back legs in a perfect circle, facing inwards. The middle of the circle is empty. The newts keep perfectly still as if they'd gone rigid. It looks like a circular palisade around some secret altar. Only there's no altar there, and no God. All of a sudden, one of them starts hissing, "TSTSTS," and swinging the upper half of its body round and round. Then the next one starts doing the same, and so on, and after a few seconds all the newts are whirling the upper half of their bodies round like a frenzy, but staying on the same spot, quicker and quicker, not saying a word, but getting faster and faster, like they were drunk or possessed. After about a quarter of an hour, one of the newts will start to get tired, then another, then a third. They'll lose their strength as they swing round and then go stiff. Then they all sit still again like statues. Then after a while, another one of them will start going TSTSTS. Another one will start swinging round, and then they're all suddenly dancing again, the whole circle. I know the way I'm describing it makes it sound very mechanical, but imagine it with the moonlight making everything white, and the waves on the shore make their long, slow sounds. There was something made it seem infinitely magical, and something made it seem evil. I stood there, hardly breathing. I wasn't sure whether I was amazed or horrified. "Here, you'd better move your feet, mate," called the man nearest to me, "else you'll start growing roots." We closed in around the circle of animals as they danced. The men held their oars out in front of them and whispered, not so much because the newts might hear them as that it was night. "Into the middle, quick," called out the commanding officer. We all ran into that circle of newts as they whirled about, and you could hear the oars as they thudded down on the newts' backs. It was only then that the newts were startled and cowered down into the center or tried to slide away into the sea between the oars, but those ones got hit with an oar that threw them back into the circle, and they'd scream with the pain of it and because they were so scared. We'd use a flagpole to push them back into the middle, squeeze them into a tight group all lying on top of each other. 10 men would round them up into a pen made of oars, and another 10 would use their oars to hit and shove the ones that tried to climb out under them and run away. It was just one mass of black, writhing meat, panicked and screaming as the oar blows landed on them in the darkness. Then they'd open up a gap between 2 of the oars. A newt would creep out of it and it'd be knocked down with a blow on the back of the head with a big stick. Then there'd be another one and a third one until there were about 20 of them lying there. "Close it," the officer ordered, and the gap between the two oars would shut. Bully Beach and Dingo, the half-caste, they'd take one of the stunned newts in each hand and drag them along the beach to the dinghy, just like sacks, not like living beings. If the newt that was being dragged along got caught between some stones, the seaman dragging him would just pull harder and give a vicious tug so that a leg might be pulled off. "Don't you worry about that," grumbled old Mike, who was standing next to me. "It'll grow back again." Once all the stunned newts had been thrown into the dinghy, the officer would just say, "Get the next lot ready." And then it would start all over again, with the newts being clubbed on the back of the head. This officer, Bellamy his name was, he was a quiet and educated man, an excellent chess player, but this was a hunt, or rather a business just like any other. There were more than 200 newts knocked out like this. About 70 of them were left because they were probably dead and not worth the effort of dragging away. Back on board, the captured newts were thrown into a tank. Our ship was an old oil tanker, and the tanks stank of oil because they hadn't been cleaned out properly, and the water had an obvious oily film over it. All that had been done was that the cover had been taken off so that the air could get to it. When the newts were thrown in, it looked thick and repulsive, like some kind of noodle soup. In some places where they moved about, they looked weak and pitiful. Over the next day, they were left alone while they came to. Then the day after, 4 men would come along and jab long poles into the soup, as everyone called it. They'd mix all the bodies together and watch to see if there were any that weren't moving or where the flesh was falling off. They'd hook them on long poles and pull them out of the tank. Then the captain would ask, "Is the soup clean?" "Yes, sir." "Pour the water in." "Yes, sir." That soup had to be cleaned like this every day, and each time they'd throw 6 to 10 pieces of damaged goods, as they called them, into the sea. There was always a lot of big and well-fed sharks closely following our ship. The stink from the tanks was awful. Despite being changed now and then, the water in them was yellow, full of excrement and bits of wet food. There'd be these black bodies lying about in it, splashing wearily or just doing nothing, hardly able to breathe. "Well, they've got it good," old Mike insisted. "I saw a ship once used to transport them in metal benzene barrels. They all died." 6 days later, we picked up new goods off the island of Nanomea. This, then, is how the trade in newts is operated. An illegal business, modern piracy to be more exact, which burgeoned overnight, as it were. It is said that nearly a quarter of all the newts bought and sold have been hunted and captured in this way. Newts multiplied in the hatcheries, which the Newt Syndicate no longer wished to maintain as farms, and overran some of the smaller islands in the Pacific so much that they became a serious pest. The local people disliked them and insisted they put entire islands in danger of collapse because of the tunnels and passageways. So the colonial authorities and the Newt Syndicate itself turned a blind eye to the pirate raids where the newts lived. It was reckoned that there were as many as 400 pirate ships occupied solely with hunting newts. As well as the small traders, there were entire shipping companies acting as latter-day buccaneers in this way, and the biggest of them was the Pacific Trade Company, based in Dublin with Charles B. Harriman as its managing director. A year earlier, it had been even worse, with Teng, a bandit from China, would use his 3 ships to directly attack the farms of the syndicate itself and had no hesitation in killing the staff if they tried to stand in their way. The previous November, Teng and the whole of his fleet had been sunk by the American gunboat Minnetonka off Midway Island. Since then, the trade in newts had kept to less wild forms of piracy and enjoyed steady growth after certain procedures had been agreed on, such as the ship's national flag being hoisted when it attacks the shore of a foreign land, that no other goods would be traded in under the pretext of piracy, that the newts acquired would not be disposed of at dumping prices but would be designated inferior quality when put on the market. Newts in the illegal trade would be sold at between $20 and $22 each. They are seen as inferior quality but very robust considering that they survived the terrible treatment on the pirate ships. It was estimated that, on average, 25 to 30% of newts captured went through this experience, and that they would be capable of going through more. In the trade jargon, they were known as macaroni, and recently had begun to be listed in regular business reports. 2 months later, I was playing chess with Mr. Bellamy in the lounge of the Hotel France in Saigon. I wasn't contracted to a ship at that time, of course. "Bellamy," I said to him, "you're a decent person, a gentleman, you might say. Doesn't it ever feel strange for you that you're doing something that, basically, is the lowest kind of slave trade?" Bellamy shrugged his shoulders. "Newts are newts," he grumbled evasively. 200 years ago they said niggers are niggers. "And weren't they right?" said Bellamy. "Check." I lost that game. It suddenly occurred to me that every move on the chessboard is old and has been played by somebody at some time. Maybe our own history has been played out by somebody at some time, and we just move our pieces about in the same moves to strike in the same way as people have always done. Maybe it was the same sort of quiet and decent Bellamy that used to hunt Negroes on the Ivory Coast and transported them to Haiti in Louisiana, letting them die on the lower decks. That Bellamy, back in those days, thought nothing of it. This Bellamy never thinks anything of it. That's why he's incorrigible. "Black loses," declared Bellamy cheerfully, and got up to go for a walk. "Hier Congress Duroda les," known in short as the Amphibians Congress. The official title of the Congress was somewhat longer. The First International Congress of Zoologists for Psychological Research into Caudate Amphibians. No true Parisian, though, likes long names such as this, so they referred to the learned professors who sat in the halls of the Sorbonne simply as Messieurs les Ourdals, the Newt men. Or else, even shorter and less respectful, those zoo men. So we went to have a look at those zoo men, not so much out of journalistic duty as out of simple curiosity. The curiosity, you understand, was not so much for the mostly aged and bespectacled scientists, but for the creatures. Why do we feel difficulty in writing the word animal, about whom so much has already been written both in scientific papers and in the popular press? There are some who say that what has been written is no more than journalistic humbug, but others say that these animals are in many respects more gifted than the Lord of the world and crown of creation himself, as man is still called even after the World War and other incidents. I hoped that the venerable gentleman taking part in the Congress for research into the minds of caudate amphibians would provide a clear and final answer for us laymen as to Andrias Scheuchzeri's fabled intelligence, that they would say to us, yes, this is an intelligent being, or at least tell us that they are as capable of civilization as you or I. For this reason, we should consider what the future might hold for these creatures, just as we should consider what the future might hold for mankind, a race once thought so wild and primitive. I tell you there was no answer given, nor any question of this sort put to the Congress. Modern science has become too specialized to concern itself with problems of this sort. So let us try to learn something about what a scientist would call animal psychology. That tall gentleman with the long beard now mounting the podium, that is the famous Professor Dubosc. He seems to be criticizing some perverse theory by some esteemed colleague, but it is difficult for us to follow this side of his argument. Indeed, it is only after considerable time that we realize that this man, speaking with the enthusiasm of a black magician, is discussing the ability of Andrias to perceive colors and his ability to distinguish various shades. I cannot be sure that I understood properly, but I left with the impression that Andrias Scheuchzeri might be largely colorblind, but that Professor Dubosc must be terribly short-sighted, going by the way he lifted his papers up to his thick glasses that sparkled wildly in the light. Professor Dubosc was succeeded on the podium by the smiling Dr. Okagawa from Japan. He explained something about reaction times and other effects that result if he cuts some kind sensory channel in Andrias's brain. Then he told us how Andrias responds if part of the auditory system is crushed. Professor Riemann, coming next, explained in detail how Andrias responds to electric shocks, at which a passionate dispute arose between him and Professor Bruckner. C'est un type, this Professor Bruckner, small, angry, and lively to an extent that verges on the tragic. Amongst other things, he asserted that the sense organs of Andrias are as weak as those of man, and that he has the same limited instincts. Looked at from a purely biological point of view, Andrias is an animal as degenerate as man, and just like man, he tries to make up for these biological deficiencies by what is known as intellect. However, the other specialists seem not to have taken Professor Bruckner seriously. probably because he had not severed any sensory nerves and had not shot any electric charges into any Newt's brain. He was followed by Professor Van Dieten, who slowly and almost reverentially described the disorders that are seen in Andrias after the right temporal lobe of the brain has been removed, or the occipital lobe from the left-hand side. Then there was a reading from Professor Devrient from America. Forgive me, I am not quite sure what it was that Professor Devrient said in his reading, as at that moment my head had begun to spin at the thought of what disorders would be seen in Professor Devrient if his right temporal lobe were removed. How the smiling Dr. Okagawa would respond if he were given electric stimulants, and how Professor Raymond might behave if his auditory cavities were crushed. I also began to feel rather uncertain about my abilities to distinguish colors and my sensory motor reactions. I started to be tortured with doubt as to whether, speaking strictly scientifically, we have any right to talk of our own mankind's spiritual life, considering that we have not butchered each other's cerebral lobes and cut sensory nerves. Should we turn on each other, scalpel in hand, to study each other's spiritual life? As far as I am concerned, I would be quite happy in the interests of science to smash Professor Dubosc's glasses or shoot electric shocks into Professor Deaton's bald head and publish an article about how he reacts. In fact, I can imagine how he would react quite vividly, although I find it harder to imagine what goes on in the wood of Andrias Scheuchzeri in experiments of this sort, even though I know already that he is a boundlessly patient and good-natured creature, as none of the lecturing professors mentioned any time that poor Andrias Scheuchzeri ever became angry. I am in no doubt that the first Congress on caudate amphibians has been a remarkable scientific success, but as soon as I have a day free I will be going to the Jardin des Plantes and straight to the tank where Andrias Scheuchzeri is held, so that I can quietly say to him, "You, Newt, your day will come one day, but please never think of examining the spiritual life of people. Berichte für die Somatische Veranlagung der Molche." In the experiments carried out by myself on the great Pacific newt, Andrias Scheuchzeri, in my laboratory in Hamburg, I was directed by one certain objective: to examine the newt's ability to withstand changes to their environment and other external influences, and thus to show how they can be put to practical use in various parts of the world and under varying conditions. The first of the experiments was intended to ascertain how long the newt can survive away from water. The subjects were kept in a dry tank at a temperature of 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. After some hours they showed distinct signs of tiredness but became more active if sprayed with water. After a period of 24 hours they lay motionless, moving nothing more than their eyelids. The pulse slowed, and all physical activities were reduced to a minimum. The animals were clearly suffering, and the slightest movement cost them a great deal of effort. After 3 days they entered a state of cataleptic stillness, zoonosis. They did not respond even if burned with an electric cauterizer. If the humidity of the air was raised, then they began to show certain signs of life, blinking if exposed to strong sources of light, etc. If a newt was thus dehydrated for 7 days and then thrown into water, it would take considerable time before it once again became active, but a large number of subjects deprived of water for a longer period perished. If left in direct sunshine, they would die after only a few hours. In another experiment, subjects were forced to turn a crank handle in the dark and in a very dry environment. After a period of 3 hours, their activity began to decline but became rose again after spraying with copious amounts of water. If the spraying was frequently repeated, the animals continued to turn the crank for up to 17, 20, or, in one case, even 27 hours, whereas a human subject acting as control was already quite exhausted after only 5 hours of this mechanical activity. From these experiments, we can conclude that newts are well suited to work on dry land, provided that 2 obvious conditions are observed. They cannot be exposed to direct sunlight, and they need to be sprayed with water from time to time. The second series of experiments was intended to test the resistance of these originally tropical animals to cold. If cooled suddenly with water, the subjects would die from intestinal catarrh. However, if allowed slowly to acclimatize to a cold environment, the subjects would become used to it, and after a period of 8 months they even remained active in water at a temperature of 7 degrees Celsius, provided they were given extra fat in their diets, 150 to 200 grams each. If the water temperature was reduced to below 5 degrees Celsius, the subjects would become stiff, geliosis. In this state, they could be frozen and kept in a block of ice for several months. When the ice was melted and the water temperature rose above 5 degrees Celsius, they would begin, once again, to show signs of life, and at 7 to 10 degrees they would become lively and seek food. It can be seen from this that there is no difficulty in acclimatizing newts, even to our own climate as far as northern Norway and Iceland. For polar conditions, further experiments would be needed. In contrast with this, the subjects showed themselves remarkably sensitive to chemicals. In experiments using very dilute lye, discharge from factories, tanning fluids, etc., the skin fell off their bodies in broad strips, and the subjects died from some kind of inflammation of the gills. This means that, for the conditions found in our rivers, newts are practically unusable. In another series of experiments, we were able to ascertain how long a newt is able to survive without food. They can be kept hungry for 3 weeks or even longer, showing no symptoms worse than a certain lethargy. I kept one of the newts hungry for a period of 6 months. After the first 3 months, it slept continuously and without any kind of movement. When the newt was then thrown into a tub of chopped liver, it was so weak that it showed no reaction and had to be fed by hand. After some days, it began to eat normally, and the newt concerned could be put to use in further experiments. The final series of experiments examined the newt's ability to recover from injury. If a subject's tail was cut off, it would regrow within 14 days. This was attempted with one newt no less than 7 times, each time with the same result. The same result was observed if the subject's feet were cut off. All 4 limbs and the tail were amputated from one subject, and within 30 days it was once again whole. If the thigh or shoulder bone of one of the animals is broken, the entire limb will fall off and a new one will be grown to replace it. The same result was obtained if a subject's eye or tongue was cut out, although one interesting observation was that the newt whose tongue had been removed lost the ability to speak and had to learn it all over again. If a newt's head is amputated or its body bisected anywhere between the neck and the pelvis, the animal dies. On the other hand, the stomach can be removed, part of the intestine, 2/3 of the liver or other organs, without any disturbance to the animal's life functions, so that we can say a newt that has been all but disemboweled is still capable of life. There is no other animal so resistant to any sort of injury than the true newt. This capacity would make of it a first-class, almost indestructible animal for use in warfare, if it were not for its peaceable nature and natural failure to defend itself. Alongside these experiments, my assistant, Herr Dr. Walter Hinkel, examined the newts to ascertain whether they could be a source of useful raw materials. We were interested in particular to ascertain whether the body of a newt contains a large quantity of iodine or phosphorus, and our positive results suggest it might be possible to extract these important elements on an industrial scale. The skin of a newt in its natural state does not have any serious use. It can, however, be ground to a paste and subjected to high pressure to create an artificial leather which is light and strong enough to offer a serious alternative to leather from the hides of cattle. Because of its repulsive odor, the fat in a newt's body is of limited use, but its very low freezing temperature makes it of possible value as a lubricant for machinery. The meat of a newt was likewise considered unusable and even as poisonous. If consumed in its raw state, it causes serious pains, vomiting, and sensory hallucinations. After a large number of experiments conducted on himself, however, Dr. Hinkel was able to ascertain that these harmful effects disappear if slices of the meat are steamed. In this way it resembles certain mushrooms, thoroughly rinsed and soaked for 24 hours in a weak solution of hypermanganese. It can then be boiled or steamed and tastes like poor-quality beef. In this way we consumed the newt whom we had come to know as Hans. Hans was an educated and intelligent animal with a special talent for scientific work. It had worked in Dr. Hinkel's department as a laboratory assistant and could even be trusted with delicate chemical analyses. We would spend entire evenings talking with Hans, who enjoyed boundless curiosity. It became unfortunately necessary to dispose of Hans after he became blind after my experiments with trepanation. Hans's meat was dark and with a slight flavor of mushrooms, but left no unpleasant effects. There is no doubt that in the event of need arising from war, it would be possible to use newt meat as a cheap substitute for beef. Dear Sir, a friend of mine, the Reverend H.B. Bertram, and I observed some newts over a long period while they were building a dam in Aden. We also spoke with them on 2 or 3 occasions, but we found no indications of any higher feelings such as honor, faith, patriotism, or interest in sport. And what else, may I ask, is there that could be seen as an indication of a soul? Truly yours, Colonel John W. Britton, Toscani. Leaving the question of a soul to one side, whenever I have had the opportunity to observe newts, they have seemed to me to have no individuality. Each one seems to be like the next, equally diligent, equally competent, and equally indistinguishable. In a word, they meet one of the ideals of modern civilization, mediocrity. André d'Artois. It is quite certain that they do not have a soul. This is something they have in common with man. Yours, G.B. Shaw. Your question left me feeling somewhat perplexed. I know, for example, that my little Chinese dog, Bibi, has a little and a charming soul, and I know that my Persian cat, Sidi Hanum, has a soul, so wonderful and so cruel. But newts? Yes, they are very talented and intelligent. The poor things are able to speak, calculate, and make themselves very useful, but they are so ugly. Yours, Madeleine Roche. It's all right for them to be newts, just as long as they're not Marxists. Kurt Huber. They have no soul. If they had, then we would have to put them on an economic par with mankind, and that would be absurd. Henry Bond. They ain't got no sex appeal, and that means they ain't got a soul. Mae West. They do have a soul, just as every other animal and every plant and every living thing has a soul. Great indeed is the secret of any life. Sandra Bharatanath. They have an interesting swimming technique. There's a lot that we could learn from these newts, especially about long-distance swimming. Johnny Weissmuller. Sitting beside our simple but clean and comfortable tank, madame. Zimmerman would read the legends of La Fontaine to us. The dampness was unpleasant for her, but she paid no attention as she was so engrossed in her task as our teacher. She called us mes petits Chinois because, just like the Chinese, we were unable to pronounce the letter R, but after some time she became so used to it that she began to pronounce her own name as Madame. Zimmelman. We tadpoles adored her. The little ones, who still had not developed lungs and therefore were not able to leave the water, cried when they could no accompany her on her walks around the school garden. She was so loving and gentle that, as far as I know, there was only one occasion when she became cross. That was on one very hot day when the young lady who taught us history put on a bathing costume and got into the tank with us and told us about the struggle for independence in the Netherlands, sitting up to her neck in water. Then our dear Madame Zimmerman became truly angry. "Get out of there immediately, mademoiselle," she shouted with tears in her eyes. "Get out and wash yourself. Get out, get out." For us newts it was a clear but gentle lesson that we do not belong among people. Later on, we're grateful to our spiritual mother that she had made us conscious of this in such an emphatic and tactful way. When we had studied hard, she would read us some modern poetry, such as François Coppéa, as a reward. "It is really rather too modern," she would say, "but, after all, even that is part of a good education nowadays." At the end of the school year, there was an open day to which the prefect of Nice and other important persons in government and other fields of excellence were invited. The most gifted and advanced pupils who already had their lungs were dried off by the caretaker and dressed in white, and then, behind a thin curtain so that they would not alarm the ladies, they would read out the fables of La Fontaine, mathematical formulae, and the history of the Capet dynasty, with all the important dates. Then the prefect would give a long and beautiful speech of thanks to our dear headmistress that brought the day to an end. As much care was given to our physical development as to our spiritual development. Once a month we were inspected by the local vet, and every 6 months each of us was weighed. Our dear mentor laid a special emphasis on the need to give up the disgusting and base habit of dancing to the moon, but I am sorry to say that some of the older students did commit this bestial disgrace in secret when the moon was full. I hope our friend and, as it were, mother never learned about this. It would have broken her great, noble, and loving heart. In contrast with Curtius, a certain telegraph clerk in Lithuania by the name of Wolterus, working in collaboration with Pastor Mendelius, invented and developed a language specially for Newts, which he called Puntic language. In it, he used elements from all the languages of the world, especially African languages. This Newt language, as it became known, became quite popular, especially in the countries of the north, although, unfortunately, only among humans. In Uppsala, there was even a chair in Newt language founded, but among the Newts themselves, there is no record of it being spoken by a single one. The truth is that the most popular language among the Newts was Basic English, which later became the Newts' official language. Our friend in the Galapagos. After the painful loss of our dear aunt, the author Mrs. Bohumila Jindovasta trademark Iovichka, my wife, the poetess Jinda's trademark Ietis Durutulo Krudimska, and I undertook a journey around the world, so that the charm of so many new and powerful impressions might go at least some way to assuage our sorrow. We arrived on the Galapagos Islands, so lonely and so swathed in legend, where we were spending 2 or 3 hours of free time in a promenade along the beach. "See how beautiful the sunset is today, my dear," I said to my spouse. "Is it not as if the whole of the sky were drowning in a sea of blood and gold?" "Do I have the pleasure of speaking to a Czech gentleman?" I heard a voice say in pure and correct Czech, not far behind us. In surprise, we looked around us in that direction, but there was no one to be seen, only a large black newt sitting on a rock and holding in its hand something that looked like a book. In the course of our travels around the world, we had already come across a large number of newts, but had not had the opportunity of engaging with any of them in conversation. So, dear reader, you can understand our astonishment when, on an abandoned shore such as where we found ourselves, we came across a newt that addressed us in our own language. "Who is that speaking?" I asked in Czech. "It was I who took that liberty, sir," the newt replied very politely as it stood up. I'm afraid it was the first time in my life that I heard Czech being spoken, and I was unable to resist. "But how come," I asked in astonishment, "you speak Czech?" "Well, I was just occupied with studying the conjugations of the irregular verb, to be," the newt replied, "as this is a verb that is irregular in all languages of the world." I pursued my question. "How, where, and why have you learned Czech?" "It was by mere good fortune that this book came into my hands," the newt answered as it handed the aforementioned book to me. The book was Czech for Newts, and its pages bore the marks of frequent and diligent use. It arrived on these shores as part of a consignment of books of an educational nature. I found myself offered the choice of geometry for the 6th form, the history of military strategy, a guide to the Dolomites and the principles of bimetallism. This is the book I chose, and it has since become my second favorite. I already have its contents by heart, although it is still able to be a continual source of entertainment and education for me. My lady wife and I expressed our unfeigned joy and wonderment at this news and the newt's near-perfect pronunciation. "It is, however, unfortunate," the newt continued modestly, "that there is no one here with whom I am able to speak Czech, and I am even uncertain as to whether the word for horse in the instrumental case is koni or koatimi." "It is koami," I informed the newt. "But no, it is koni," objected my lady wife. "Would you be so kind as to tell me of the latest events in Prague, the mother of cities with its 100 towers?" asked our dear companion with great enthusiasm. "The city is growing, my friend," I explained, pleased at his interest, and briefly adumbrated the recent efflorescence of our golden metropolis. "This does indeed portend well for the future," replied the newt with unfeigned pleasure. And are the heads of the Czech aristocrats still to be seen impaled around the towers? That was a long time ago, I told him, somewhat, I confess, surprised by his question. That is indeed a pity, opined this likable newt. It was a historic monument of great value. We can be thankful to the Lord God that took so many remarkable historic monuments in the 30 Years' War. If I am not mistaken, the Czech lands were at that time transformed into a desert, stained with blood and tears. We can also be grateful that the negative genitive did not perish at that time. This book explains that it is currently disappearing, and I will be indeed sorry if that is indeed so. So you take an interest in our history, I exclaimed with joy. I do indeed, the newt replied. Especially the subjugation that followed the Battle of White Hill and the 30 Years' War. I have read a great deal on the matter in this book. I'm sure you must be very proud of your 3 centuries of subjugation. It was a great era for the Czech people. Yes, it was a difficult time, I said, thinking to humor him. A time of oppression and sorrow. And did you suffer greatly? Asked our friend with enthusiasm. We suffered unspeakable and unrelenting sorrows under the yoke of the oppressor. I'm very glad to hear it, the newt said with relief. That's just what it says in the book. I'm glad to hear that it is true. It is an excellent book, sir, far better than Geometry for the Sixth Form. I would be very glad to stand on the memorable spot where the Czech aristocracy were executed, as well as on the other celebrated places of cruel wrongdoing. You must look in on us when you are there, I invited sincerely. Thank you for your kind invitation, said the newt with a bow. I am, however, unfortunately not at liberty to travel as far as... We could buy you, I declared. That is to say, the National Collection might be willing to procure the means to... Hearty thanks, mumbled our friend, clearly touched. But I have heard that the water of the Vltava is not good. You see, in river water we suffer severe diarrhea. Then he considered the matter a little and added, And I would also be sorry to abandon my dear little garden. Oh, exclaimed my lady wife, I am also very fond of gardening. I should be very grateful if you would show us something of the local flora. With the greatest of pleasure, dear lady, said the newt, bowing most politely. If, that is, it is of no concern to you that my garden is under water. Under water? Indeed, 200 meters under water. But how is it possible to cultivate flowers 200 meters under water? Sea anemones, our friend informed us, including some very rare species. There are also starfish and sea cucumbers, not to mention the bushes of coral. To cultivate one rose is to cultivate one's homeland, as the poet tells us. It was necessary for us to make our departure, for the ship had already given its signal. And what message do you have, mister? I asked, uncertain as to the name of our dear companion. My name is Boleslav Jablonski, the newt told us shyly. I consider it to be a very beautiful name, sir. I chose it myself from this book. And what message do you have, Mr. Jablonski, for us to convey back to our people? The newt considered the matter for a short while. You may tell your compatriots, he said slowly, deeply moved, tell them that they should always maintain the ancient disagreements among the Slavonic peoples, that they should always retain Lipany and the defeated White Hill in their grateful memory. Farewell, he ended suddenly, attempting to overcome his feelings. As we departed in the dinghy back to the ship, full of thoughts and tender feelings, our friend stood on the rocks and waved to us, and as he did so he seemed to call something out to us. What was that? He cried, asked my lady wife. I do not know, I answered, but it sounded something like, Give my greetings to the mayor, Dr. Bax. Women of the world, in the interests of decency and morality, the League for the Protection of Newts calls on you to contribute your handiwork to our campaign to provide newts with suitable clothing. The most suitable garment would be a skirt 40 centimeters long, 60 centimeters, at the waist and preferably fitted with elastic. The skirt should be pleated to enable better ease of movement for the wearer. For tropical areas, a mere apron will be adequate, fitted with the means to fasten it at the waist, which could be made from very simple working materials, such as some of your own discarded clothing. In this way, you will remove the need for the unfortunate newts to work in public and in the presence of human beings without any sort of decent covering, which they cannot do otherwise than feel as an insult to their dignity, and which could only be a cause of unease for any decent person, especially women and mothers. There is no indication anywhere that this call met with any success. It is not known whether any newts ever chose to wear a skirt or an apron. It would probably have gotten their way underwater and been difficult to keep up. And wherever the newts were separated from human beings behind a wooden fence, there would have been, of course, no reason for either humans or newts to feel any shame or emotional discomfort. The idea that the newts needed to be protected from harassment of various sorts was mainly because of dogs, which never were able to get used to them and would chase the newts in a barking frenzy, even underwater, and despite the fact that if they ever bit a newt, it would leave a caustic slime in their mouths. There were even times when the newts would defend themselves, and more than one doughty hound was killed with a pickaxe or crowbar. Between dogs and newts there developed a permanent, deadly enmity which was intensified, rather than weakened, when a physical barrier was put between them. But that is often the case, and not only between dogs. These fences, coated with tar and stretching often along hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of coastline, were also used to teach the newts proper behavior, and along the whole length of them they were painted with large letters urging for instance, your work, your success, value every second. The day has only 400 seconds. You're only worth as much as you work. A meter of dam can be built in 57 minutes. The worker serves us all. Who will not work, let him not eat. And so on. Considering that these wooden fences stretched along more than 300,000 kilometers of coastline around the world, you can imagine how many encouraging slogans would fit onto them and how much they were of benefit to everyone. In this way, the matter was brought to its end. It is not known how the Port Authority in A got round this difficult problem, but the whole matter goes to show that the newt problem will need to be regulated with new judicial provisions that address it directly. At this point, it is worth mentioning that the press, especially in the United States, would occasionally publish reports of girls who had been raped by a newt while bathing. As a result, the number of cases in America where a newt was captured and lynched or burned alive multiplied rapidly. Scientists came forward to protest at this folk custom, insisting that their anatomy made it physically impossible for any newt to commit a crime of this sort, but their words were in vain. Too many girls had sworn that they had been assaulted by a newt, and so for any regular American the matter was clear. Later on, at least, the sport of burning a newt alive was only allowed to take place on a Saturday and under the supervision of the fire brigade. The Society for the Prevention of the Lynching of Newts was established under the leadership of the Reverend Robert J. Washington and counted hundreds of thousands of members, of whom almost all were mere Negroes, including the Reverend Washington. The American press began to maintain that this was a political movement with the intention of overturning the government. As a result, the areas inhabited by Negroes came under attack, and many of them were themselves burned alive, especially those who prayed for Brother Newt in their churches. The climax of indignation against Negroes reached its peak when a black church in Gordonville, L. was burned down, and the fire spread to the whole of the city. But this is only incidental to the story of the newts. We can at least list a few of the advantages that the newts really did receive. Each salamander was listed in a registry of newts with the place where he worked. It was required to obtain an official residence permit. It had to pay income tax which, as the newts received no wages as money, was paid by its owner who would then deduct it from the newt's food. It was likewise required to pay rent for the coastline where it lived, local tax and contribute to the erection and upkeep of the wooden fences, school taxes and other public costs. In short, we have to admit that the temple of the salamander cult, to be found at number ***** in **** Street, has at its center a large pool paneled with dark red marble. The water in the pool is perfumed with fragrant essences, warmed and illuminated from below with continuously changing colored lights. All else in the temple is darkness. At the chant of the Newt liturgy, the entirely naked followers of the cult step into the rainbow-colored pool, down marble steps, men on one side, women on the other. Many of its adherents belong to the highest society, such as Baroness M, S, the film star, D, the Member of Parliament, and many other outstanding personalities. Suddenly, a blue light shines on an enormous marble block that emerges from the water and on which there is an ancient black newt, lying at rest but breathing heavily. This is Master Salamander. There is a period of silence, and then Master Salamander begins to speak. He calls on the faithful to devote themselves, and with all their souls, to the forthcoming ceremonies of the Salamander dance, and to revere the great Salamander. Then he raises himself and begins to sway and vigorously twist the upper half of his body. The male members of the faithful, immersed up to their necks in water, begin also to twist and swing in a frenzy that becomes faster and faster in order, so they say, to create the sexual medium, while to Salamander's utter loud TSTSTS and raucous croaking. Then the colored lights under the water go out one after another and the orgy begins. We cannot be sure that this description is entirely reliable, but it is certain that the police in all the major cities of Europe not only spent large resources on persecuting these salamander sects, but also spent large resources on covering up the enormous scandals associated with them. It seems that although the cult of the salamander was very widespread, its ceremonies did not always take place in the fairy tale splendor described here, and that, among the lower classes, they took place on dry land. Comrades Newts. The capitalist world order has found its latest victim. When the proletariat, newly aware of class consciousness, made the putrescent tyranny of capitalism shake in fear of revolution, the exploiters had to find a new servant to bend to its needs, and took you, workers of the sea, to be the new slaves of bourgeois civilization, took your spirit, subjected you to repressive laws, took away any freedom you ever had, and did all in its power for you to be exploited by its friends with impunity. Working Newts, the time is coming when you will be aware of the burden of slavery to which you are subject, and claim your rights as a class and as a nation. Comrades Newts, the revolutionary proletariat of the world reaches out to you. With all means available, establish trades unions, choose shop stewards, establish a strike fund. Remember that the enlightened workers will not let you down in your rightful struggle, and hand in hand with you will mount the final assault. Oppressed and revolutionary Newts of the world, unite! The final battle has begun. Signed, Molokov. Newts, throw down your arms. Pacifist Manifesto. Newts, throw the Jews out. German flysheet. Comrades Newts, anarchist Bakuninists. Comrades Newts, Sea Scouts. Newts, our friends. Public address by the Union of Aquarists and Marine Life Cultivators Societies. Our friends, the Newts. Society for Moral Regeneration. Citizens Newts, Citizens, Reform Society, Dieppe. Newts, our colleagues, come and join our ranks. Society for the Support of Former Seamen. Our colleagues, Newts, a gear sailing club. One of these declarations had been carefully glued in place by Mr. Povondra, and seems therefore to have been especially important. We therefore quote it here in full. Nice, the 6th of May. There's lively activity today in the light and charming offices of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies on the Promenade des Anglais. 2 agents de police are holding the clear for invited guests to stride up the red carpet into the welcoming and pleasantly cool amphitheater. There's the smiling mayor of Nice there, and the local prefect in his top hat. There's a general in his light blue uniform and gentlemen wearing the red button of the League of Honor. Ladies of a certain age. Terracotta seems to be the fashionable color this season. Vice admirals, journalists, professors, and elderly celebrities from all around the world, such as you find on the Côte d'Azur at any time of year. Suddenly something happens to disturb this honorable assembly when a strange little creature appears and tries to make its way unseen among them. It's covered from head to foot in some kind of long black cowl or cape. Its eyes are covered with enormous dark glasses. and suddenly and unsure of itself it tries to enter the crowded vestibule. "Hey vous!" shouts a policeman. "Qu'est-ce que vous cherchez ici?" But then one of the distinguished university staff appears beside the startled figure, and then it's this way: "Cher docteur, as you please, cher docteur." This is Dr. Charles Mercier, an educated Newt who, today, is due to give a lecture to all the best people on the Côte d'Azur. Let us hurry inside to find a seat in the excited auditorium. On the podium sit Monsieur le Maire, Monsieur Paul Mallory the great poet, Madame Maria Dimineanu, on behalf of the International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation, the rector of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies, and other official figures. To one side of the podium there's a lectern, and beside it, yes, folks, that really is a tin bathtub I can see there. A perfectly ordinary tin bathtub, such as you might have in your own bathroom. Two porters accompany the timid figure, concealed beneath his long cape, onto the podium, and the applause from the audience seems somewhat ill at ease. Dr. Charles Mercier bows shyly and looks round, uncertain as to where he is to be seated. "Voilà, monsieur," whispers one of the porters, pointing out the tin bathtub. "That's for you, sir." It's obvious that Dr. Mercier feels highly embarrassed and is uncertain how he's to turn down such attentiveness by his hosts. He tries his best to sit down in the tub without drawing attention to the situation, but his long cape gets caught up in his feet and fall down into the tub with a loud splash that soaks all these gentlemen on the podium who, needless to say, pretend that nothing at all has happened. Somebody in the audience begins to laugh hysterically, but the people in the front row look round and admonish him with a loud "Shh." Then Monsieur le Maire et Député stands up and begins to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he says, "it is my honor to welcome to the beautiful city of Nice Dr. Charles Mercier, the outstanding scientist among our near neighbors who lie in the depths of the sea." Dr. Mercier stands up in the water and gives the audience a deep bow. This is the first time in the history of civilization that land and sea have worked hand in hand in intellectual pursuits. Until now, there was a clear boundary that our spiritual lives were not able to cross. That was the oceans that surround us. We were able to sail across them, we were able to plow our way through the waves in our boats in any direction we wanted, but, ladies and gentlemen, it was not possible for civilization to penetrate beneath its surface. The sea that surrounds the little pieces of land occupied by mankind has always, until now, been something wild and unknown. At same time as it offered us astonishing possibilities, it has always kept us away. On the one hand we saw the rise of civilization, and on the other we saw nature, eternal and never-changing. The barriers created for us by the oceans, dear listeners, are now falling away. Applause. It is to us, the children of this great age we live in, that comes the great fortune to be eyewitnesses to the process of our spiritual home expanding, to see it burst out from its own shores and enter the waves of the sea, to conquer the depths of the sea and combine the ancient knowledge of the oceans with the modernity of civilization. That is an inspiring prospect. Bravo, ladies and gentlemen. It is now that, for the first time ever, the culture of the oceans has appeared. And here with us today, we have its most eminent representative, whom we have the honor to welcome here among us. Our planet has become a planet that is truly and wholly civilized. Enthusiastic applause. Dr. Mercier, in the bathtub, stands and bows. Monsieur le Maire and Député then turned to Dr. Mercier, who was supporting himself on the edge of the bathtub, deeply touched and sucking hard on his gills. "My dear doctor, as a great scientist you will be able to convey our best wishes to your friends and compatriots on the seabed, to tell them how we admire them and sympathize with them. We send our greetings to those at the forefront of progress and knowledge, a forefront which, step by step, will colonize the endless expanses of the sea and create a new world of culture on the seabed. I can already see the rise of a new Athens, a new Rome in the depths of the oceans, the efflorescence of a new Paris with an underwater Louvre and an underwater Sorbonne, with an underwater Arc de Triomphe and an underwater war memorial, with underwater theaters and underwater boulevards. Allow me to express one of my most secret thoughts. It is my fondest hope that in the blue waves of the Mediterranean, just here off the shore of our city, there will be a new Nice, a glorious niece that will be your niece, with her own majestic avenues under the sea, her own meadows and promenades alongside our Côte d'Azur. We welcome you and look forward to a deeper acquaintance. I am personally convinced that closer social and scientific contacts between us, making such an auspicious beginning here today, will lead our nations to ever closer cultural and political cooperation in the interests of all of mankind, world peace, prosperity, and progress. Long applause. Now, Dr. Charles Mercier stands up and does his best to thank the mayor and representative of Nice, but he seems to be too touched by the occasion, or else his pronunciation is rather too strange for us to understand. All that I could catch from what he said with such difficulty was a few words. If I am not mistaken, they were great honor, cultural contacts, and Victor Hugo. Then, clearly overwhelmed by the experience, he hid himself back in the bathtub. After this, it was the turn of Paul Mallory to speak. But what he said was not so much a speech as an anthem, lit with the poetry of deep philosophy. "I thank my fate," he said, "that I have lived to see one of mankind's most beautiful myths fulfilled and confirmed in such a strange way. Instead of the mythical Atlantis sinking under the waves, we have the astonishing sight of a new Atlantis emerging from the deep. Dr. Mercier, you are a poet of geometry. You, along with your learned colleagues, are the first ambassadors from this new world, from the sea, not Aphrodite born of the foam, but Pallas Anadyomene. Strangest of all, though, of a mystery incomparable with end missing. The Commission for the Study of the Newt Question achieved a great and useful function, mainly by settling all difficult questions in politics and economics. It was in permanent session for many years and met on more than 30 occasions, diligently concerned with unifying the international terminology for newts which, up till then, had been in hopeless chaos. Besides the scientific terms of salamander, newt, petrachus, and so on, which had begun to take on a rather disrespectful character, there were many other different names suggested. The newts could be referred to as tritons, neptunids, bathides, abyssals, hydrians, gens de mer, sous-marins, and so on. It the task of the Commission to select the most suitable name, and it was vigorously active in this affair right up to the end of the Newt Age, although it never did arrive at any final and unambiguous conclusion. "Why on earth not?" the gentleman asked. "There are newts here." "I'm not afraid of newts," he objected. "They have some kind of factory or something under the water," the lifeguard admonished. "Nobody is allowed to bathe here." "But why not?" "The newts don't like it." Chapter 3. Mr. Povondra reads the papers again. There's nothing that makes the passage of time more obvious than seeing our children grow. Where's little Frank now, who we left, so recently it seems, on the tributaries on the left bank of the Danube? "Where's our Frank got to?" grumbled Mr. Povondra as he opened his evening paper. "You know, same as always," said Mrs. Povondra, bent over her sewing. "Out chasing after girls again, is he?" said Mr. Povondra disapprovingly. "Damn boy! Nearly 30 years old he is, and never spends a single evening at home." "He certainly gets through his socks fast enough," sighed Mrs. Povondra as she drew another worn-out sock over the wooden last. "Now what am I going to do with this one?" she said as she contemplated a large hole on the heel that resembled the outline of Ceylon. "Better just throw it out, I suppose," she thought critically, but nonetheless, after further strategic considerations, she stuck her needle decisively in at Ceylon's southern coast. A dignified, homely peace reigned for a while, the sort the Povondras were so fond of. There was only the rustle of the newspaper and the fast-moving needle and thread to answer it. "Have they got him yet?" asked Mrs. Povondra. "Who?" "That murderer, the one who killed that woman." "I can't be bothered with this murderer of yours," grumbled Mr. Povondra with distinct contempt. "I've been reading here about how tensions have erupted between China and Japan. That's a serious matter, that is." "It's always a serious matter out there." "I don't think they're ever going to catch him now," Mrs. Povondra opined. "Who?" "That murderer. They don't often catch them when they murder women. Japan doesn't like it that China's been regulating the Yellow River. That's politics, that is. For as long as the Yellow River keeps playing up, they'll keep on having floods and famines in China, and that keeps China weak. Pass me the scissors, Mother. I'll cut this one out. What for? 'Cause it says here they've got 2 million newts working on the Yellow River. That's a lot, isn't it? I should say so. Mind you, girl, I'm sure it must be America that's paying for it. Why would the Mikado want to put his own newts in there? And look at this. What is it? The Petit Parisien says here that France won't like it at all. And I sure they won't. I wouldn't like it either. What wouldn't you like, dear? For Italy to extend the island of Lampedusa. That's a very important strategic position, that is. Italy would be able to threaten Tunis from there. And the Petit Parisien says that Italy wants to turn the island into a first-class marine fortress, that there are 60,000 armed newts already there. Just think of that, 60,000. That's 3 divisions, Mother. There's something going to happen down there in the Mediterranean, if you ask me. Have a look yourself. I'll cut it out for you. In the meantime, Ceylon had disappeared under the industrious needle of Mrs. Povondra and reduced itself to no more than the proportions of Rhodes. And there's England, too, don't forget, Mr. Povondra considered. They're going to have their troubles, too. In the House of Commons, they've been talking about how Great Britain will be left behind all the other states where water constructions are concerned. They say all the other colonial powers are building new shorelines and reclaiming new land all the time, while the British government is too conservative and won't trust the newts. And that's quite true, Mother. Very conservative they are, the English. I knew someone once who worked at the British Embassy, and he would never let our Czech sausage past his lips, not for the life of him. Said they didn't eat it in England, so he wouldn't eat it here. I'm not surprised other countries are getting ahead of them. Mr. Povondra nodded his head earnestly. And there's France extending its coastline out by Calais. So now there's panic in England that the French might start shooting at them across the channel, if the channel gets any narrower. That's what it comes to. There's nothing to stop them extending their own coast off Dover, and then they should shoot at France. Why would they want to do that, dear? Asked Mrs. Povondra. You don't understand these things. These are military matters. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some trouble there. And if not, there it'll be somewhere else. It stands to reason, Mother, with all these newts, the world situation is entirely different. Entirely different. Do you think there's going to be a war? Asked Mrs. Povondra uneasily. I wouldn't want our Frank to get mixed up in any war. War? Thought Mr. Povondra. It'd have to be a world war so that the world powers could divide the sea between themselves. We'll stay neutral, though. Somebody has to stay neutral so that they can supply arms and all that to the others. That's how it works, concluded Mr. Povondra. But you women don't understand these things. Mrs. Povondra pressed her lips together and, with a few quick strokes of her needle, finished the elimination of Ceylon from young Frank's sock. And just think, said Mr. Povondra with hardly suppressed pride, this dangerous situation wouldn't have arisen if it hadn't been for me. If I hadn't let that sea captain in to see Mr. Bondi that time, then the whole course of history would have been different. There are other doormen who wouldn't have let him in, but I said to myself, I'll take on that responsibility. And now look, you've even got countries like England and France having trouble because of it, and there's still no knowing what might happen next. Mr. Povondra drew vigorously on his pipe. That's how it is, my love. The papers are full of stories about the newts. Here's another one, look. Mr. Povondra put down his pipe. It says here that newts have attacked some village near the city of Kanke-Santarai in Ceylon. Seems the natives had been going out and killing them. The police and a squad of the local militia were called in. Read. Mr. Povondra read. And then there was a proper shooting match between the newts and the people. Several of the soldiers were injured. Mr. Povondra put down his paper. I don't like the sound of that, Mother. Why's that, then? Asked Mrs. Povondra as she carefully and contentedly clicked the scissors over the place where the island of Ceylon had been. After all, there's nothing there. "I don't know about that," exclaimed Mr. Povondra as he stood up and began to pace anxiously up and down the living room. "I don't like the sound of that at all. Newts and people shooting at each other. You can't have that sort of thing going on." "Maybe these newts were just trying to defend themselves," laughed Mrs. Povondra as she put the socks away. "Exactly," grumbled Mr. Povondra uneasily. "If these horrors start trying to defend themselves, things are going to turn bad." "It's the first time they've done that. Oh my God, I don't like the sound of that." Mr. Povondra stopped pacing and stood in thought. "I don't know, but maybe I should never have let that sea captain in to see Mr. Bondi.